Archaeology meets deconstruction. The lives and controversies of two French giants. Michel Foucault was born on October 15, 1926, in the ancient town of Poitiers, France. He entered the world quietly, the second child of a well-regarded surgeon named Paul Foucault and his wife Anne Malapert. Their house was not grand, but it was respectable, and it bore the aura of professional pride. There was little in those earliest years to suggest he would become a thinker who would transform how people understood knowledge, power, and the very framework of modern institutions. Yet his childhood, marked by a strict and sometimes oppressive sense of discipline, carried hints of the intellectual obsessions and questions that would, much later, come to define him. His father, perhaps expecting young Michel to follow him into medicine, was a stern figure, exacting in his expectations, and the boy discovered early on that the world was full of structures imposed from above, structures he often felt compelled to resist. As a child, Foucault was, by many accounts, sensitive and prone to self-reflection. He would later share stories about feeling alienated in his hometown. He struggled with his own sense of belonging, and this sense of estrangement was compounded by bouts of depression that would return at various junctures in his life. He was intellectually gifted, but he chafed against the confines of the conventional education system that thrived on rote learning and traditional hierarchies. The hidden tensions of power, or at least the sensation that authority surrounded him and demanded acquiescence, became part of his earliest personal experiences. While the young Foucault might not have had words for this sense of invisible force exerted upon him, he was learning to sense it everywhere, in the home, in the classroom, in the shadows that hovered over small-town life. When he finished his secondary education, Foucault decided he wanted more than the provincial atmosphere of Poitiers, and so he sought admission to the elite École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most prestigious centers of higher learning in France. In 1946 he was accepted. He was not yet the iconoclast he would become, but he found himself immersed in a rigorous environment that demanded intellectual excellence. The École Normale was also known for its intellectually radical environment. Students debated the ideas of Sartre, Marx, and an array of avant-garde thinkers. While Foucault's early academic performance was sometimes uneven, he soon discovered an intense interest in philosophy and history. He became fascinated by the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger, thinkers who would have a significant impact on his later projects. During these years, Foucault struggled with his mental health. He went through severe depressive episodes that led him to attempt suicide more than once. He found psychoanalysis interesting, but was never particularly impressed by the prevailing Freudian or Lacanian paradigms. Perhaps ironically, given his later critique of psychiatric power, he felt on occasion that psychological therapy might help him. Yet he never surrendered to its interpretive frameworks, which he suspected were part of a broader social apparatus that categorized, diagnosed, and controlled individuals under the guise of scientific neutrality. It was during his studies at the École Normale that he met Louis Althusser, the Marxist philosopher, who recognized Foucault's brilliance early on and gave him support at a difficult time. Althusser encouraged Foucault to join the French Communist Party briefly, which Foucault did, though his membership was short-lived, and he soon found himself alienated from the party's strict ideological line. Nonetheless, the experience acquainted him with a certain mode of critical analysis, one that treated social institutions as embedded in broader systems of power. Foucault pursued a teaching career after graduating, traveling to places like Sweden, Poland, and Germany to serve in cultural and diplomatic posts. He was drawn to libraries and archives wherever he went. There was something about old texts and records, the dusty repositories of knowledge, that captured his imagination. Long before he would coin the term archaeology to describe his method of excavating the layers of discourse that constitute knowledge, he was in a sense practicing it. He would immerse himself in texts, searching not just for facts but for patterns, the hidden assumptions, the discursive moves, the ways institutions spoke about madness, health, or criminality at different points in history. His first major work, Madness and Civilization, appeared in 1961 and caused quite a stir. He challenged conventional histories of mental illness, showing that the idea of madness was not an eternal category, but rather something that changed radically from one epoch to another. He argued that during the Renaissance, madness was both feared and revered as a kind of insight, that in the classical age it became an object of confinement, and that by 2018, the birth of modern psychiatry, it had come under the sway of moral and scientific discourses that claimed to be objective, but which, in Foucault's view, were deeply political. Though the book later drew critique from historians questioning Foucault's selective use of archival sources, it launched him into intellectual fame. The method he employed, this so-called archaeology, unsettled people. It implied that what a society thinks it knows so well, whether madness, criminality, sexuality, or anything else, might simply be a function of that society's shifting configuration of power and knowledge. After Madness and Civilization, Foucault continued to dig deep into the historical conditions of possibility for various disciplines. In 1963, he wrote The Birth of the Clinic, which analyzed how medicine became institutionalized in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, shaping the clinical gaze that separated physician from patient. Then, in 1966, he published The Order of Things, a sweeping inquiry into the evolution of the human sciences. Its opening scene, the reflection on Diego Velázquez's painting Las Meninas, became famous for the illustration of how representation operates. The book's audacious claim that man might be just a recent invention of Western knowledge, and thus possibly nearing its end, sparked a flurry of intellectual debate. Foucault followed up with The Archaeology of Knowledge in 1969, a text that spelled out the methodological underpinnings of his previous works, although some critics found it difficult reading, a bit too abstract or systematically unsystematic in its approach. Throughout the 1960s, Foucault was part of the Parisian intellectual scene alongside figures like Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Roland Barthes, and Jacques Derrida. There was an energy in Paris, a sense that philosophy, linguistics, psychoanalysis, and politics were converging in new ways. Structuralism and post-structuralism were either in the process of formation or just about to crest into broader public awareness. Foucault, though sometimes labeled a structuralist, always resisted easy categorization. In public, he often insisted that he was not exactly a structuralist, not exactly a Marxist, not exactly a Freudian. He was deeply suspicious of any totalizing system that claimed it could fully explain the complexity of human behavior or social relations. He once famously quipped, "Do not ask me who I am and do not ask me to remain the same," suggesting his wariness of rigid identities or labels. A major turning point came in 1975, when he published Discipline and Punish. If one single work defined Foucault's contribution to the study of criminal justice and power, this was it. The book began with a gruesome description of a public execution in 1757, depicting the torture and dismemberment of a regicide named Robert François d'Amiens. Foucault contrasted that overt, brutal spectacle of pain with the relatively mundane and controlled nature of modern imprisonment in 19th century France. He argued that there had been a shift away from punishing the body to disciplining the soul. That is, whereas punishment in earlier centuries often aimed to terrorize and physically harm the convicted, modern systems of punishment, prisons in particular aim to reform, categorize, and normalize. Drawing on Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon, a design for a prison in which inmates could be observed at all times without knowing whether or not they were being watched, Foucault proposed that modern societies were becoming panoptic. It was no longer necessary for authority to exert brute force everywhere. The possibility of being watched was enough to ensure compliance. Power, in this new sense, had become productive rather than merely repressive. It produced docile bodies that would internalize the norms and expectations of society. It also produced subjects, in the sense that individuals became shaped by these ubiquitous forms of surveillance and control. His exploration of prisons was simultaneously an exploration of a broader mechanism of discipline that permeated schools, hospitals, factories, and all manner of institutions. Discipline and Punish garnered immediate attention and controversy. On one hand, many sociologists and criminologists found his thesis electrifying because it prompted a rethinking of the modern penal system's function. Was the prison truly a humanitarian advance over the scaffold, Or was it just a more insidious mechanism of control that hid its brutality behind walls and routines, all while claiming to rehabilitate? On the other hand, critics argued that Foucault overstated the uniformity of power, sometimes neglecting the role of human agency, social movements, and resistance. But for Foucault, power was not something merely top-down. It was a capillary force that flowed through society's networks. Everyone, in their own way, was caught in webs of power, yet they also participated in reproducing these webs. There was a sense in which Foucault was calling on readers to recognize that power was everywhere, and that it was precisely because it was everywhere that it was so difficult to see and to resist. In the midst of this intellectual work, Foucault led a life that was as colorful as it was tumultuous. He was openly gay at a time when mainstream French society was not always comfortable with homosexuality. He frequented the more radical social scenes of Paris and San Francisco, exploring the subcultures that challenged conventional forms of identity and desire. His experiences shaped his thinking about sexuality, confession, and the way societies impose norms on bodies and pleasures. Although he did not publicly define himself by his sexuality, it undoubtedly informed his critical stance towards psychiatry, law, and social institutions that sought to define normal and abnormal behavior. He was, by all accounts, someone who tested boundaries, whether they were intellectual or personal. By the late 1970s, Foucault had taken up a new research project that would result in his multi-volume History of Sexuality. Volume 1, entitled An Introduction, came out in 1976, offering a controversial refutation of what he called the repressive hypothesis. The common belief was that society had for centuries repressed sexuality, making it taboo to speak about. Foucault argued instead that the so-called repression was in fact an incitement to discourse. Modern societies never stopped talking about sex. Rather, they talked about it in highly regulated scientific, moral, and medical ways. Sex became a matter of classification, diagnosis, and confession. It wasn't that people stopped speaking of sexual acts. Quite the contrary. They spoke constantly, but within carefully drawn lines of power knowledge. This argument was in harmony with his earlier focus on how discourse, knowledge, and power intersect to shape not just what people do, but how they understand themselves. Foucault planned 4 more volumes on sexuality, but only 2 more were published in his lifetime: The Use of Pleasure and The Care of the Self, both in 1984. They shifted focus from modern systems of repression to ancient practices of self-cultivation in Greco-Roman culture, where individuals shaped their ethical being through exercises and disciplines. The sudden change of historical period perplexed some of his followers, but Foucault saw it as a logical extension of his work on how subjects come to see themselves as subjects. Even as he looked back to antiquity, he was still exploring the ways in which societies produce norms of behavior and identity. With these last writings, he addressed a different angle: the aesthetics of existence, or the idea that one might consciously shape one's life as a work of art. This theme opened up new avenues for understanding ethics, not merely as submission to rules, but as the practice of creative freedom within structures of power. It was a partial response to critics who felt Foucault's work left little room for agency. Controversy followed him into these years as well. He had taken political stances that sometimes baffled his contemporaries, such as a fleeting enthusiasm for the Iranian Revolution in 1978, which he initially interpreted as a spiritual revolution, challenging modern forms of governance. Critics argued he oversimplified a complex event. He also became involved in the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, GIP, an organization he helped found in 1971 to gather and publish information about prison conditions in France. This activism made him a well-known figure in radical political circles, although he never aligned himself neatly with the left, right, or any official party. The controversies that haunted him often centered on the charged question of whether he was advocating total moral and cultural relativism. Many worried that his critique of humanist and Enlightenment ideals undermined the possibility of progress. He insisted, however, that he was not an anti-Enlightenment thinker. He was simply trying to demonstrate how Enlightenment ideals themselves were produced within power structures that deserved critical scrutiny. Foucault's life ended abruptly in 1984, when he died of complications from AIDS on June 25. The tragedy of his relatively early death left many of his projects unfinished and many questions unanswered. His influence, however, only grew. He had changed how scholars in fields as diverse as philosophy, sociology, history, literary studies, anthropology, and political science conceptualized power. No longer was power seen merely as a tool wielded by one group to dominate another. Instead, it became a pervasive force inscribed in discourses, institutions, and everyday practices. Perhaps the greatest testament to Foucault's influence is that nearly every study of punishment, madness, sexuality, or institutional authority now grapples with his claims. His genealogical method, which he adapted from Nietzsche, would inspire thousands of doctoral theses seeking to uncover how truths come into being through conflicts and contingencies. It is impossible to consider Michel Foucault without acknowledging the controversies he engendered. Some felt he was too focused on discourse, neglecting real economics and class struggle. Others believed his emphasis on the microphysics of power overlooked broader structures of domination. Still others criticized him for not offering a clear program for resistance or liberation. But he often responded to the demand for solutions by explaining that philosophy's role was not to dictate solutions but to question, to show how what we take for granted is the result of historical forces and can be changed. In a sense, he was the consummate critical philosopher, one who challenged the fundamental assumptions of his day and tried to loosen the grip of what seemed inevitable. In parallel to Foucault's journey, another figure was emerging from the same broad milieu of French intellectual life. Jacques Derrida was born on July 15, 1930, in El Biar, a district of Algiers in French colonial Algeria. Though separated from Foucault by only a handful of years, Derrida's trajectory would be quite different. He came from a Jewish family and experienced firsthand the discriminatory policies of the Vichy regime, which enforced quotas on Jewish students. This early sense of exclusion and marginalization would shape his thinking about identity, language, and the instability of meaning. He eventually moved to France, where, like Foucault, he studied at the École Normale Supérieure. Derrida's intellectual breakthrough came in the late 1960s, almost in tandem with Foucault's emergence. In 1967, Derrida published 3 seminal works: Of Grammatology, Writing and Difference, and Speech and Phenomena. These texts introduced the concept of deconstruction, a radical way of reading that sought to show how texts undermine their own assumptions by revealing internal contradictions or aporias. Derrida's earliest interventions often focused on the privileging of speech over writing, a deep-rooted hierarchy in Western philosophy going all the way back to Plato. He argued that writing, often considered a mere supplement to spoken language, had in fact its own primacy, and that meaning in language was never stable or self-identical. Instead, words constantly referred to other words in an endless chain of signifiers, deferring any final sense of closure. This was the basis of what he called difference, a neologism that indicated both the act of deferring and differing. Derrida became a controversial figure almost immediately. Some hailed him as a genius who exposed the hidden logocentrism in Western thought, its reliance on a metaphysics of presence, the assumption that we can have pure access to meaning or truth. Others accused him of being deliberately obscure or nihilistic, undermining the possibility of clear communication or moral responsibility. He was pigeonholed, often unfairly, as the emblem of postmodern relativism. His style was indeed playful and sometimes cryptic, full of puns and wordplay. But for Derrida, that was precisely the point. Language itself is elusive, and any attempt to capture meaning once and for all was doomed to failure. Deconstruction was not a method that aimed to destroy meaning. Rather, it aimed to reveal the complexities and instabilities always at play. Like Foucault, Derrida became an icon of French theory, with a massive following in literature departments in the United States and Europe. Whereas Foucault was often investigating historical and institutional contexts, hospitals, prisons, clinics, Derrida was more immersed in texts, philosophical works, literary works, even the institution of philosophy itself. One area where they converged, briefly and tensely, was the question of madness in Descartes. Foucault's History of Madness had argued that Descartes effectively excluded the mad from the realm of reason, thereby participating in a broader strategy of confinement and marginalization. Derrida responded in his essay, Cogito and the History of Madness, suggesting that Foucault's reading was itself too literal or too historical, missing the deeper structure of Descartes' argument. A public exchange followed, and relations between them became strained for some time. The clash signaled the difference in their approaches. Foucault was trying to unearth the historical forms of exclusion, while Derrida was highlighting the complexities of philosophical language itself. The event remains a famous intellectual dispute, emblematic of the different directions post-war French philosophy could take. Derrida's influence soon spread beyond philosophy into literary criticism, law, theology, and political theory. He offered challenging readings of Plato, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, among others. But he also turned to more contemporary figures like Emmanuel Levinas, analyzing the ethical dimensions of language and alterity. As time went on, Derrida engaged with ethical and political questions more directly, writing on topics such as hospitality, democracy, justice, and the politics of friendship. He famously declared in Spectres of Marx, 1993, that deconstruction was never as apolitical or anti-Marxist as some claimed. Rather, it shared a deep concern with justice that was, in a sense, always to come, something that could never be fully attained, but must remain an infinite call or promise. In 1992, Derrida became embroiled in a notable controversy at Cambridge University, where he was proposed for an honorary degree. A group of analytic philosophers published a letter in the Times protesting that Derrida's work did not meet the standards of clarity and rigorous argumentation. They claimed it was pseudo-philosophy. In the end, Derrida received the degree, but the affair illustrated the wide gulf in philosophical styles and underscored how controversial Derrida remained in certain circles. Much like Foucault, he was labeled a postmodern guru, a charge that often overlooked the nuance in his work. Derrida wrote prolifically until his death in 2004 from pancreatic cancer. Works like Margins of Philosophy, Glass, and The Postcard continued his playful yet deeply critical engagement with Western philosophical and literary traditions. Even after he passed, debate continued over what exactly deconstruction entailed and whether it was an unassailable philosophical approach or an extravagant style of textual reading that led nowhere. Yet his impact on literary studies, cultural theory, and continental philosophy is undeniable. He helped open the door for scholars to examine the assumptions built into language and representation, and he was a key figure in a broader wave of post-structuralist thought that included Foucault. Comparing and contrasting Foucault and Derrida offers a lens into a significant chapter in modern thought. Both were deeply influenced by Nietzsche and Heidegger. Both took part in the radical intellectual environment of mid-20th century France, and both were suspicious of humanist narratives that placed man at the center of philosophical inquiry. They believed that historical and linguistic forces shaped human subjects in ways they themselves only partially grasped. Both also rejected universalizing narratives, whether those of the Enlightenment, Marxism, or psychoanalysis. Yet they diverged in their emphases and methods. Foucault was more historically oriented, analyzing the evolution of social institutions and epistemic frameworks, whereas Derrida was primarily focused on textuality, the play of signifiers, and the inherent instability of meaning. While Derrida dissected canonical texts to find the unspoken assumptions and tensions, Foucault would delve into archives to unearth how discourses emerged, became dominant, and shaped real institutional practices. In terms of controversies, both men found themselves at odds with mainstream philosophy at different points. Foucault was accused of downplaying the role of class, economic structures, and explicit political struggle. Derrida was accused of obscurantism and excessive wordplay. Foucault drew criticism for what some saw as a celebration of power as omnipresent and thus unstoppable. Derrida drew criticism for what some saw as a total relativization of meaning and thus a potential abdication of moral responsibility. Both claims are oversimplifications, but they point to the ways in which each thinker disrupted well-established intellectual norms. Derrida's controversies in postmodernism often hinged on whether his deconstruction effectively torpedoed truth claims, making everything a matter of linguistic play. Foucault's controversies often revolved around the bleakness of his genealogical exposés. Did they leave any space for freedom, revolution, or emancipation? Neither philosopher was easily pinned down. Foucault's genealogical method, especially as seen in Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, can be seen as a grand critique of the hidden operations of power in societies. His analysis of criminal justice remains a cornerstone for criminological theory, prompting a rethinking of the very function of punishment. He showed how the prison system, while seemingly more humane than the scaffold, introduced new forms of surveillance and control that extended far beyond prison walls, permeating everyday life. This reading of power as productive rather than merely repressive suggests that our modern social order is constantly shaping us, forming our bodies, our identities, and our sense of ourselves. His life, marked by activism on behalf of prisoners and intellectual inquiry into the historical roots of modern institutions, underscores his deep commitment to making the invisible operations of power visible. Derrida's contributions, while not oriented toward criminal justice or institutional analysis, have deeply influenced literary theory, philosophy, and critical thinking about language. His writings invited scholars to question the very foundations of meaning, to see how texts contain contradictions and multiple layers. He called attention to the margins, supplements, and footnotes that mainstream narratives ignore or minimize. In doing so, he opened up a space where voices and perspectives that had been excluded might be heard. Derrida's controversies largely revolved around whether his approach undermined the foundations of rational thought or ethics. But he often insisted that deconstruction was not synonymous with destruction. It was, in his words, a way to intervene in the texts and institutions to make them more just, more open to the other. Deconstruction always carried with it an ethical political dimension, even if it was not always spelled out in the language of manifestos or policy proposals. Historically and biographically, both thinkers came of age in a period of political upheaval in France, the aftermath of World War II, the Algerian War of Independence, the student revolts of 1968. This context shaped their questioning of authority and tradition. Both were teachers at the École Normale Supérieure, where they influenced and were influenced by brilliant cohorts of students and colleagues. They each had moments of discord with the French Communist Party, as well as with mainstream university institutions, and each travelled extensively to give lectures, becoming internationally renowned. They also had complicated relationships with Marxism, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology, at times critiquing them fiercely, at times drawing on them. For Foucault, genealogical criticism was a way to trace how modern subjectivity was formed through historical ruptures and continuities. For Derrida, deconstruction was a method of reading that exposed how philosophical binaries, speech, writing, presence, absence, inside, outside, were never as stable as they seemed. While Foucault's vantage point on power and institutions had obvious overlaps with leftist critiques, he famously refused to situate himself firmly in any ideological camp. Similarly, Derrida, while often seen as a leftist figure, also refused to reduce his work to a neat set of political directives. Both men were keenly aware of how intellectual life itself was embedded in networks of authority: the university, the publishing world, the media. Their controversies thus sprang in part from the friction between academic conventions and their own bold, sometimes theatrical challenges to convention. Derrida's playful style, his puns and elongated footnotes, exasperated those who wanted a straightforward philosophical argument. Foucault's genealogical style, his leaps between centuries, and his refusal to offer normative solutions frustrated those who wanted a direct political program. Yet, if one shifts perspective to the legacy each thinker left behind, one finds that they both open new lines of inquiry that remain vital. In critical legal studies, in the analysis of power relations, in theories of discipline and social control, Foucault's footprints are everywhere. In literary and cultural criticism, deconstruction transformed the way people read texts, dismantling the notion that an author's intention could fully guarantee meaning. Both, in distinct ways, asked readers to become more attentive to what was not being said, to the silences, the exclusions, the marginal details that carried the mark of power and difference. Both approached intellectual work not as a static discipline, but as a form of ongoing critical practice. The final chapters of their lives serve as fitting codas to their intellectual projects. Foucault, lecturing at the Collège de France, turned increasingly to the question of the self and ethics, looking back to ancient practices like Stoicism and early Christian asceticism, exploring how individuals constituted themselves morally. Derrida, in his later work, turned to themes of hospitality, forgiveness, and justice, arguing that true hospitality required openness to the radical other, and that justice was always an aspiration never fully captured by legal systems. Both men, in their own ways, signaled that the critical analysis of structures, discourses, and texts should not be an end in itself, but rather part of a broader project of living differently, more justly, more freely, if such a thing could even be pinned down. The controversies around them never fully vanished. Instead, they evolved. Foucault's reading of history has been scrutinized and sometimes found wanting in factual detail or nuance, but his overall theoretical insight has remained influential. Derrida's approach to language and text has been criticized as overly complex or as lacking in direct political engagement, yet his notion of deconstruction has permeated humanities scholarship so thoroughly that it is impossible to imagine literary criticism without it. Their differences in methodology, Foucault's genealogical approach versus Derrida's deconstruction, reflected different understandings of how best to question power and truth. Both recognized that what passes for knowledge in any epoch is bound up with larger forces, historical, discursive, and institutional. But while Foucault studied these forces by tracing their development over time and showing how they shaped social practices, Derrida probed the linguistic structures, the philosophical assumptions that made such knowledge possible and simultaneously unstable. For students of philosophy, sociology, literature, and critical theory, the story of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a chapter in the struggle to articulate what it means to be a subject in the modern and now postmodern world, subject to norms, subject to language, subject to discourses that predate and outlast any individual. Foucault's story, the boy from Poitiers who struggled with mental health and confronted institutional power from the outside in, became the story of a thinker who dissected modernity's hidden strategies of control. Derrida's story, shaped by his Algerian Jewish identity and his lifelong exile from philosophical mainstreams, became the story of a thinker who challenged the unspoken logocentrism of the entire Western tradition. They both belong to a generation that revolutionized French thought in the mid to late 20th century, a generation that included figures like Roland Barthes, Gilles Deleuze, and Jean-François Lyotard. These individuals, though distinct, shared an impulse to question the foundations of knowledge, the neutrality of reason, and the stability of meaning. In many ways, that broader movement was a response to the horrors of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Algerian War, all of which cast doubt on the Enlightenment's optimistic faith in progress and human reason. Foucault and Derrida's shared suspicion of any overarching system that claimed universal validity can be seen as part of that post-war reckoning. Today, one can see Foucault's influence in debates about the prison-industrial complex, mass surveillance, and the disciplinary mechanisms of schools and workplaces. His concept of the panopticon has been adapted to analyze everything from social media to global counterterrorism measures. The question of who watches, who is watched, and how we internalize the norms of watchers is as pertinent as ever. Meanwhile, Derrida's work lives on in debates about how we interpret texts, how we negotiate cultural difference, and how we approach the idea of justice that transcends legal frameworks. His idea that meaning is always to come, that it cannot be pinned down once and for all, resonates with thinkers who are wary of dogmatism in politics or religion. Despite their differences, both men showed an acute awareness of how historical discourses and institutional frameworks shape the possibilities for thought. They both underscore that neither philosophy nor critical theory can be neatly separated from the world they critique. Each word, each concept, is already caught up in a history. Whether one calls that history the archive, Foucault, or the text, Derrida, it is a history that speaks through us even when we believe we are speaking it. In that sense, both Foucault and Derrida engaged in projects that aim to make us conscious of the genealogies and textualities within which we exist. Reflecting on their lives as a single story, Michel Foucault, with his intense focus on the archaeology and genealogy of discourse, and Jacques Derrida, with his relentless deconstruction of philosophical concepts, one sees how French intellectual life in the late 20th century fostered radical shifts in thought. They stirred up lasting debates. Is truth historically contingent, or is there some universal rational standard? Is language capable of delivering truth, or does it only ever deliver partial, deferred, contingent meaning? Is power inescapable, or can we imagine forms of resistance that produce new forms of subjectivity? While Foucault died in 1984 and Derrida in 2004, their philosophies endure in the questions they left behind. They continue to haunt the realms of academic discourse, cultural criticism, and political activism. Their controversies remain alive because the problems they posed about power, knowledge, language, and justice are not resolvable by a single theory or method. Rather, these are ongoing issues that each new generation confronts in its own context. Foucault and Derrida serve as reminders that the frameworks we rely on to understand ourselves and our world are not eternal truths, but historically or linguistically contingent constructs that can, and perhaps must, be challenged, dismantled, or reimagined. Consider again the boy Michel, feeling out of place in Poitiers, reading books in secret, pressing his forehead to cold window panes, sensing a power in the very air around him that demanded something of him. Or the young Jacques, exiled from his Algiers school because he was Jewish, later devouring philosophical texts and finding them full of secret hierarchies that claimed universality, but excluded those deemed other. Both would go on to question the very premises of Western thought, each in his own way reminding us that the stories societies tell about themselves, about sanity, truth, justice, language, are never innocent or transparent. They are shaped by authority, by the desire to classify, by the structure of signifiers that produce and defer meaning. If there is a final lesson in their intertwined stories, it might be this. To engage critically with the world is not to reject it or fall into despair, but to ask continually how the categories and discourses that define our existence came to be, and whether they might be different. Foucault's genealogical approach shows how phenomena like criminal justice, psychiatry, and sexuality have been historically molded, how the shape they currently take is by no means inevitable. Derrida's deconstructive approach shows how language itself, the medium of these stories, is fraught with tensions and contradictions, how each word both reveals and conceals. Far from rendering one powerless, these insights can empower a more reflective, flexible, and ethically engaged stance toward the world. And so we leave them in their paradoxical legacies. Foucault, the archaeologist of knowledge who used history to dissect the roots of modern power structures, died at the very moment he was turning toward the question of how we might fashion ourselves ethically in the face of these structures. Derrida, the deconstructor of textual certainties, remained to the end concerned with justice and the necessity of an endless questioning of what we think we know. Both remain monumental figures whose life stories, rich in controversy, activism, scholarship, and philosophical daring, continue to shape and challenge the intellectual landscapes in which we live.